Great to be here. I know Mary Fran and I had such great pleasure working with your team on this study, so we're glad to share the findings with you all. And I would love just to set the context of why this study of topic of new skilling was important to you, Mike, and important to Cornerstone.
Sure. So the idea behind this is we have this notion of upskilling and reskilling and so on, and it's a common to the lexicon in the last year, 2 years, even 3 years now. We've been talking about this as things changed. But the idea behind new skilling is it really isn't just about upskilling and reskilling, but rather around new skills and being able to develop those in flight. Both from an individual perspective and from an employer perspective, because we're trying to look around corners. So that's what prompted me to, as we entered into our conversation, to talk about that as a research topic.
Yeah, and it was fun. I guess I use the word fun a lot when I talk about
it. Was fun. It was
but I'm
fun.
a research nerd, so is Mary Fran. But it was fun. And that topic of looking around corners, we sought to examine how L&D teams, HR teams were doing this. And we're producing this new research report called The Revolution is Now, New Skill Your Workforce to Catalyze Change. And it will be ready late next week for your ability to download. But we're going to be sharing some of the findings to give you a preview of what we found. And we would love your participation in our polling. And if you have questions for us, we're all here to answer any questions you have about new skilling. And I just wanted to just set the context, since we are the research team, about what we've did in this study. So we deployed a survey in May and June of this year. We had about 260 organizations participate. And if you're not familiar with HCI research, our sample is HR practitioners and leaders, mostly in North America. And we saw, which we love to see, is sizes of people from all different sizes of organizations, and about half had fewer than 1,000 employees. And we also like to combine that quantitative data collection with our qualitative interviews. And Mary Fran does a great job of speaking to practitioners, to thought leaders, to SMEs, to understand what it's actually like to put context around the numbers that we find. And we had great participation there. So thank you all. And I always plug HCI research. If you're interested in participating, join our survey panel, because you'll be alerted to all our surveys and you'll get access to all our research reports. And also, to set the context of what we do in our research, we have an index called the High Performing Organization Index. And this is a self-report measure that we ask in all our studies to examine and contrast the behaviors and practices and attitudes of our survey respondents who are from high performing organizations, to compare them to all others. And in this index, we have about 14 different scale items that relate to talent and business outcomes. So for example, asking about retention rates, profitability, innovation, and we combine that into an index, and about 26% of our survey samples around that each time become high performing organizations, and they report better outcomes. We want to know we want to learn from them. What do they do differently? How do they approach these topics? And what can we do to apply what they've learned already in our own organizations? And we've done this, I think, 3 years, Mary Fran.
Yeah, no, and I just wanted to clarify too, I know the skepticism there can be around self-reported indexes, but over the 3 years we've done this, remarkably consistent, favorably comparable to all of our secondary research and subject matter expertise on what best practices look like. So there's some strength building behind it. And as we move forward and we see stronger consistency around it, I feel it's really heartening. It helps really inform the direction of our research and our understanding of what works best.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, the other thing that you do really well with that is there's some outcome-based components of it as well. So although it is self-reported, you're actually looking at outcomes as well as practices, which is what appealed to me when we started this research.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And what we'll do today is share with you some of the findings from high-performing organizations, but also look at an aggregate, what are organizations across the board doing in these efforts in learning and development. I just feel like I set the context a lot, but I also want to set the context about, we deployed this survey we kicked off this research study in March, and obviously we know our world has dramatically changed since then and will continue to change. And we think that normal is gone. We've seen the prevalence of remote work. We've had its implications for the way we structure work in our non-work lives, how we manage childcare and family responsibilities. We saw dramatic and awful shifts in industries like travel and leisure. And we've also seen the highest unemployment levels in the US ever. So we're very cognizant of the effect that COVID has had on us. But it also gave us some pause to think that maybe this topic of new skilling is even more relevant than ever as organizations had dramatic changes overnight. And how are those organizations prepared and the people within them prepared with the skills needed to meet those change? So that's why we're very excited about this research. I think doing a research study in COVID is always tenuous because you don't know how the sample will change over time. But I think this topic will be relevant for the rest of 2020 and the years to come for sure. So Mike, why, and because of COVID, because of also we were interested in this topic before COVID happened, why is reskilling more important now than ever?
Well, again, to add to the backdrop and to your point around just not even in the US, but there's a number of things going on globally, such as in the UK, there was some government intervention, which is going to come off in the fall. And so there's all kinds of dynamics that are going to go on in the job market over the next year or two. And so that's a good frame up, but there's also some other things in the backdrop that I want to kind of touch on. And the first one was, the World Economic Forum, it does a really good job, by the way, of publishing some broad kind of research. And one of the ones that they came out with that I've thought about for a long time is this notion that 47% of core skills are going to atrophy by 2022. And they suggest that it's going to take 101 days of individual training just to keep pace, which is 10% of total time. So it's not just skills that artificial intelligence can't supply or difficult to develop at scale. You've also got things like cognitive decision-making skills that even work within the trades. You can't get a robot to replace your window, and you can't get people that or robots to come in and assemble a smart home. So it's not just the technology, it's also the cognitive decision-making skill set that they're talking about as well. And it's driven by this idea of the fifth industrial revolution. We've all heard about the fourth, but the fifth industrial revolution is going to change the way we interact with our smart devices. We know very rapidly that the interface is going to change from tapping and so on to what they call invisible design, eyeball movement and voice and those kinds of things. And natural language is going to be a new way to rule. And then, as a result of that, the fifth industrial revolution is also taking into account this notion of moving from the Internet of Things to the intelligence of things, and 5G allows for that. So we've ticked this device connectivity box, but it's more than just this headline grabbing. A good example of that is drones. Drones are able to quickly identify dry spots in a field, and the automated water systems know how to go hit those things and so on. So this Internet of Things is rapidly becoming an intelligent of things. And I always like to tell this story. When I was in school, in college, and I went home, and my dad was the CFO of a very large company. And I went home and I said, Dad, when I'm in school, they teach me how to look at the pros and the cons and do a SWOT analysis and so on. But they don't ever tell me exactly how to make a decision. How do you go about that? And I'll never forget this. My dad lowered the newspaper. I'm dating myself, obviously. Lowered the newspaper, looked at me, kind of shrugged his shoulders, and he said, you go with your gut. So judgment is still a big part of the kinds of skills that we need to have, but they have to be framed against the background of the data that's being driven and the context of the environment that we find ourselves in. And those are new skills as this continually changes. Even before COVID, estimates were that at least 14% of the global workforce may need to switch categories. So yeah, robots are coming to take your jobs. But the expectation is that there are actually going to be more jobs generated in this judgment and cognitive area than existed before. So that's, to me, the basis by which we need to think beyond just upskilling and reskilling, but new skills, because these are new ways of thinking that I'm excited about. So as a background for the research, I think that's one of the big drivers for new skilling.
That's great. And just clarifying that when you say judgment and new ways of thinking, but we also saw in our research, like the more softer professional type of skills come out as important.
In my mind, the same thing. If I can actually create some judgment, I have to be able to communicate it. I have to be able to make it meaningful for those that I'm trying to communicate with. And those are the kinds of skills that we're going to need moving forward.
Yeah. And I just wanted to say, I think that it's not just that normal is gone, it's that normal is going, gone. It's been going for a while, but we hit a moment of punctuated equilibrium. And, I'm looking to the future, even with things like quantum computing and things that will match neurocognitive speed. So it really is about heart after that. And we're going to have to bring greater sensitivity and that sort of emotional intelligence to our work.
I like that a lot, Mary Fran.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is share some of our findings from our survey, and I'm sure this will resonate with you as well as a listener. We asked you, this is an agreement question, and 50% of our survey respondents say external skills shortages, meaning they can't find the skills they need in the marketplace, will negatively affect their ability to meet their strategic goals. And also 67% say skills gaps in their current workforce are going to do the same. So obviously they're very challenged in terms of they're concerned about meeting what they want to do in the future for their business by the lack of skills in their workforce currently. Mike, any reactions or thoughts to?
Well, I think that has always been an issue, but I think businesses, as they find themselves trying to adapt and to adjust, this idea of not being able to meet the strategic goals, and it's not because we don't feel like we have the right people, or we don't feel like we have the right skills, but we don't have them in the right place at the right time. And as the businesses change, the strategic goals change at lightning speed. We have to be able to change too. And I think that's I'm giving you my opinion of the sentiment here, but I think that's where it's driven from, thinking about this timing when we did the survey.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can HR and learning and development professionals and also business leaders close these gaps that we see in skills gaps, skill shortages? And we know that you're facing many challenges. So we asked you, what are the top challenges for developing new skills? And we asked you to select the top 3. And a lot of these are challenges we see when we talk about a lot of other topics too, like partnering with the business or using analytics in terms of lack of time, lack of support, lack of tools. But the one that came up top is the balancing the long-term and the short-term business needs, meaning I need to develop people, but we also have way too much to do. How do I do that? Any thoughts, Mary Fran or Mike, about what we see as challenges for our listeners?
What I found really interesting here was that number 1 and number 3 are really two sides of the same coin. And in any survey, when you start hearing this notion of lack of time, I often think that may be a red herring in terms of emphasis on investment. And it could also be related to the stressors that people are feeling now as they're moving their modality in the idea of remote work. But a lack of time is often code for I've got all these other things that I'm worried about, and it becomes a bucket. For me, a practical mechanism to maybe attack this a little bit is to spend some time in your adoption curve, in your change management, and communicating the importance of this and finding the right time. And I think we all struggle a little bit right now with this work-life balance and this balance against all these other things. I think all of us sort of feel like we're working more, but the lack of time can often be related to the adoption curve. In other words, I don't have time to do that, when really what we're doing is we're not prioritizing it. And I think that's the difference.
Yeah, that word priority is a pretty key thing too. I think lack of time can also correspond to, a lack of understanding which skills to focus on first. So when there's a big pit of need, as sometimes there is when change hits rapidly, what do you see as most important first? So sometimes understanding that leads to the time crunch that provokes that top item on the L&D challenge, which is we can't balance our long and short-term needs because we first of all, we can't identify what's a long-term as opposed to a short-term need, right? We can't set that priority.
And that perfect transition into another question we asked in our research was what do you use, or what sources of information do you use to identify skills needs, or identify the skills you need now and in the future. And we looked at the differences between those from high performing organizations, again, those with better talent and business outcomes compared to all others. And these are the ones with the most dramatic, significant differences between the two types of organizations. So we see those from high performing, they're more likely to use direct feedback, meaning they ask like what are we missing here? And also have those feedback mechanisms to capture and track those needs over time. They're also more likely to use assessments and also competency models. So I mean, they have defined criteria of what success looks like, and they're able to identify people who fit that criteria and help develop them along the way.
But Mike, we just talked about change, and you said some very strong things about the rate of change and the pace of change. And so we know that the skills we're going to need are already, we may not even know what they are yet. That's how fast the change is. So will a competency model help or hurt us in terms of keeping up with that change? Mike, give us some insight into what we can do with this information.
So what I found, so first off, the good part of this analysis here, or the good news in this, is that we're, in our high performing organizations in particular, we are soliciting feedback from our business. That's important, right? We need to ask our business what we think it needs, and we need to ask our people what they're seeing. So creating this feedback loop is an important component, and so kudos for doing that. What was of interest to me, though, is in classic strategic workforce planning, there's a variety of steps, and one of them is called the external scan. In other words, what is the environment that we find ourselves operating in? And I didn't see that come up. So the advantage of having this direct feedback, the disadvantage of that is that we might find ourselves operating in an echo chamber. So we got to be careful of that. So I think adding an additional lens or an additional dimension is one idea, particularly when you talk about change management, because you're bringing in a diverse viewpoint that may not be embedded in the business. So it gives us an opportunity to speak to what we'll need in the future. The second thing around competency models or frameworks is we know they work to a point, but we also have to be able to understand that they may not work in some of the other areas, particularly the innovative areas that we're looking for. So this idea that we have a feedback loop and a framework together with an external scan, I think would work in tandem as a three-legged stool rather than relying on one over the other.
And I really like that you gave kudos and said that was great to have those feedback mechanisms in place. Because I feel like sometimes people say, well, you're being too reactive or you're just an order taker. But asking the question, like, what do you need? What do you see? That's just really smart. So I'm glad our survey respondents are doing that.
I agree.
And we want to, so we asked a similar question in the survey, but we also want to hear from you. What are the three, I'm just going to limit you to three, three skills that are the hardest to find at your organization? You could be, and we didn't specify if it's inside or outside your organization, but what are the three skills? You could type them into the polling application to the right of the player. And we would love to see these come in right now.
Adaptiveness.
I also like ownership and accountability. That's true. That's a good one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Communication.
Is adaptiveness similar to problem solving? Why or why not?
Yeah, in a sense it is, because you have to be able to think on your feet, and you have to be able to think in context of what you know versus what you don't know. So you have to be able to adapt that and then go after the problem itself. So it requires an open-mindedness, don't you think?
Yeah, I feel they're very closely connected. Opportunities, cross-functional collaboration. Collaboration showing up a lot, and that really has to do with how well we communicate ideas and thoughts and connect to the mindset of the people that we're working with, right?
I also saw risk-taking, which is important. It's something we've focused on at Cornerstone, particularly in the current time. A lot of people, when things occur like COVID, people want to hunker down and stand pat, and it's the opportune time to promote risk-taking, but you have to be able to create the culture by which it's allowed. But it's a great skill, absolutely.
See a lot of communication in several responses here. The interpersonal, emotional intelligence, ability to get your judgments and your thoughts out effectively, and hear them heard. I think very
I
important.
saw technology. That's going to figure prominently in the next few slides. I can't even begin to state how much we saw tech skills as this growing piece of need.
Absolutely. I also saw hand soldering, which is technology in its own way. I know lots of practitioners, and you have to be good at that if you're going to be able
Oh,
to.
it is. It's part art. I mean, I think that it's like, there is a zen to those skills, and it's hard to interest people in those skills, right?
As well as teach them.
Right.
That comes from experience and, the kinds of cognitive judgments that we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw resilience, and I feel like there's some comments to be made there, Mike, in terms of its connection to things, because resilience is an ability that relies on a lot of other traits. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, actually, I'll go back to Daniel Pink and his autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right? That's what people look for in a role. Resilience means that even though I have the autonomy to do certain things and I'm looking for mastery, it also, creates this sense of purpose. Resilience means that I'm able to have this confidence in myself and therefore can adapt and adjust back to the adaptiveness. But resilience to me in some ways is a confidence level. And I always talk about culturally, you have to allow for the baseball analogy, take a big swing for the fences. And if you don't, pick yourself up and swing again. And that can be very hard for some people to do, but it's the key to innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And resilience also being tied to the need for social support and collaboration. I believe you can't bounce back or bounce forward without having
Fair point.
Your needs taken care of by others as well.
You can be a tough cookie, but if you don't have a safe space to fail forward, it's going to be hard.
Yeah.
A lot of emphasis on safety right now for employees as well. And you're seeing good HR departments working through this notion of safety to create that environment. Agreed.
Yeah.
And overall, if we could just do a quick scan in terms of the balance between technical and professional skills coming in here from our survey from our viewers.
It looks fairly well balanced, and I see some commonality in the way that they connect to each other.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you all for responding.
Thank you very much. That was fun.
And we did ask a similar question of you in our survey. We wanted to know, what are the hard to find technical and professional skills needed most right now? And we got a lot of responses, and Mary Fran did an excellent job of coding all thousands of them and to putting them into the hard to find skills by role. And then what we see here is the green bar is technical skills, and then professional skills is the blue bar. And then the word label going up and down, that's the most frequently cited in that category. Any thoughts or reactions to what we see here, Mike, by role type, but also what the top hard to find skills are?
What I found really interesting is, and we talk a lot about the soft skills and so on. It was evidenced by the survey we just did. But as we move into a different environment, we're going to see more gig workers. So that's where my eyes went originally when we looked at this research. But what I was struck by is we expect temporary or gig workers to come prepared. They got the skills, they're ready to go. That's why we hired them. That makes sense. But what surprised me is the entry level roles and the idea behind whether they be entry level or apprenticeships or interns and so on, which I know Mary Fran bundled together. We still expect them to come ready as well. And I think that is the antithesis to what we used to think about. If we find the right skills, we can teach you the technical skills. People are looking for the individual contributors in the entry levels to come ready to rock, ready to roll.
Yeah. I think if we're thinking about the fifth industrial revolution and the idea that 65% of people in school are training for jobs that don't exist yet, right? And so what skill sets could they possibly have for those jobs that don't exist yet? So it almost represents a little bit of an I don't want to say outdated, because I'm not trying to be accusational, but our approach to looking for entry-level roles might be a little dated, because given the newness of some of these skills, it's going to be hard. It's not just that they're hard to find, it's that they're impossible to find. So you have to work on building them, right?
Yes, we need to adjust our expectation to some degree, I think.
Yeah. And what barriers are we creating in our recruitment process that make it harder to find these skills when maybe it's just looking at the process? I saw a video of someone posting 5 years experience needed for this special app, but the app is only 3 years old. So how could you have 5 years experience in it when it hasn't existed for 5 years? So I think you can be very critical of the thresholds and the benchmarks you have in your recruitment process to make sure that you're not making it even harder on yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And we love, so the title of this webcast is, do you know what new skilling even means or really means? So we want to make sure you're walking away with what that means compared to the topics that Mike mentioned earlier, the reskilling and the upskilling. So I don't want to read to you, but Mike, can you just give us a nice synopsis of what we mean and how these three things interact?
So reskilling is the classic, we're the auto worker example, right? We have all these auto workers that knew how to manufacture. The automotive industry changed, and we wanted to reskill those people. Upskilling is this idea of improving and focusing on certain skills and deepening their ability to do that. Both of those things are important. I don't want to diminish that point. But new skilling is around understanding from a data perspective what the next level is, whether or not because they're new, they don't necessarily exist in a current form. So what are the additional skills that make up this notion of a new skill and for the new roles? And I think an important point here is that new skilling is this constant state of refresh and comes with pressures on the individual. Every year, there's an Idleman Trust Barometer that comes out. It's a global barometer of how people are feeling about their environments. And we as a society tell through this trust barometer that we're feeling the pressure. We think our jobs might evaporate between all the stressors that are going on. So we're adding an additional stressor with new skilling. We have to be able to approach it from a what's in it for me perspective moving forward, because what's in it for the business is obvious. What's in it for the employee, there's an investment that needs to be made there. So new skilling is really around new roles that we haven't thought of yet and being able to use existing skills as a set of building blocks to this new skill.
And it's an emerging practice, because
absolutely
clarified, because in our research, it's not like we found a set of organizations who are actively doing this all the time or consistently or very well. So we're just, can you share, Mary Fran, about what we found in terms of the number of organizations doing this?
I don't think we have anybody really. New skilling truly is new, and I think the skepticism that always surfaces around whenever there's a new term introduced is like, oh, it's just a new name for old tricks, right? We do some version of this. No, new skilling is actually new. It's it reminds me of a lot of the new tools that are coming online for strategic planning, in the sense that we're trying to use microtrends to extrapolate macrotrends. And we're trying to surface new information that's going to help us prepare for the skill gaps that we're going to have that we're not even yet aware of. And so nobody's doing that because those technologies are just coming online. But what we do find in the research is that there are people who have a framework for best practices that they are implementing in advance of those changes, so that they're going to be ready to adopt that move, when they can. And so what is it, I think that's part of what this research was really intended to look at, was what is it that you can do to set the stage for that, because we're rapidly coming to a point where we can't do without it.
And speaking about who's ready, and goes us nicely into our next question. We asked, which of the following groups is involved in these learning activities? So we looked at senior leaders, HR, L&D, your people managers, employees themselves, and third-party consultants. And we wanted to know who's involved to set learning priorities, who designs learning, who contributes content, who delivers and who's accountable for results. I know, Mike, you have a lot to say about the accountable for results column, but just like who's involved and how, when you think about a new skilling approach, an all hands on deck approach, I would think we say more people involved, the better, especially when it comes to the accountability for results, the learning priority part as well. Mike, any thoughts here for what we found?
I think what's really interesting to me is as I read this, and if you're in L&D, you're probably going to go, well, yeah, I knew that, is there are a lot of people talking about the learning priorities, but a lot of it still lands on the shoulders of L&D in terms of what happens, as well as accountability for the results. So if we think of true learning, true new skilling as behavior change, then we want to be able to take and measure that across our businesses, which means that we need to be able to ask more on the results around, did it actually happen? How did it move the needle on the business? And I know we'll talk about measurement here in a little bit. But I think to me, as I looked at this, other than the classic joke around, well, consultants come in, but they're not accountable for anything. Other than that joke, I think what's really important is we want to be able to create more accountability across the entire continuum of the business, particularly with our line managers, our people managers, if you will, the first level managers, because we can't do this ourselves and we can't leave this to L&D. Our first level managers, I forget the study, but it was like touches 11.4 people, and I always got a kick out of the 0.4. But there are multiplier effects, so we need to enlist their help in this initiative.
Yeah, I know we talked about this the other day, but the only having 44% of employees being accountable for the results, meaning they engage with the training or development opportunity, but they're not expected to change or do anything differently back on the job. So I think that's a significant challenge here.
Well, and Mike, I know that you mentioned when we talk about developing a culture of shared accountability around learning efforts is really important to this, even up to the senior level. If we're going to rely on feedback and information from senior leaders, but they're just going to give opinions on how to set priorities without having to be accountable for what comes out of that, then how valuable is the feedback in that equation, right? So talk to us a little bit about shared accountability on a larger level.
I think shared accountability, and you're right. And I think where that comes from is being very clear on what the measures are, what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Because you can set priorities, you can design learning, but if you're not clear about what is it that you're starting, and then what is it that where you're starting and where you ended up and how it impacted the business, you don't have a mechanism for accountability. By design, if you have these measures in place, and if you have the breadth of a portfolio of measures, that accountability by default then comes across the entire organization. It does require an all hands on deck approach.
Yeah, agreed.
And related to that all hands on deck and having more people involved to support new skilling efforts, we asked, what are the ways employees at your organization share knowledge and help each other learn? And we look at the methods for doing so. So there could be that informal exchange, like, oh, I'm on Teams, I'm going to message Mary Fran with this article I found that will be interesting to her. Or it could be more formal things like mentoring relationships through a formal mentoring program or employee-led lunch and learns. And it looks like if you're doing one, you're probably going to do another of these, and you're going to be supporting a new an effort from the bottom up to support peer-to-peer and employee-led learning. Any thoughts or reactions to these methods or mechanisms, Mike?
Well, what I found really interesting in this particular piece was kind of the compression that everything sort of landed close together. There was no real standout, maybe outside of the informal exchange. But it also reinforces the mechanisms of collaboration that many other learner surveys tell us, which is I learn more from others around me. And so it's this mechanism of collaboration and a culture of collaboration that has a real impact in how employees contribute. What's really interesting when we look at those learner surveys is not only do they say, yes, I learned better, but they're also just as willing to contribute. So it's a way to actually create more, if you will, and meaningful kind of content. At Cornerstone, every quarter we have something called Development Day, and it's learning and development for us, by us, and management gets out of the way, and it's a collaborative approach, a formal mechanism, if you will. But it's all the lunch and learns and the informal training, and I love the stretch assignment. I'm a firm believer in stretch assignments. So it's all these things that I think come together, and it's the compression of these things that tell me pick one and do it well, because it'll have impact.
I just want to introduce one term too, and Mike, and get your impression on it. But to me, this is like the difference between establishing a baseline for growth mindset. I know that that's a really appealing concept for many of us that work in L&D out in organizations. And I think the idea is that it can be intimidating to share your expertise and ideas and opinions. So you have to make it acceptable to stretch your ideas about what good practices, or to stretch your ideas about new findings, new research, new information. And so, you know, that growth mindset, that idea that like, well, this is a problem we're going to solve, and maybe there's different kinds of information out there. I don't know. I feel like those are closely related. Mike, do you have anything to add on that?
Well, it's not just the culture of the big swing, which I'll go back to, because I firmly believe in that, but it's also a culture of and. So I heard what you said, and not I heard what you said, but. And I know that's a simplification, but it really starts from a culture perspective, embracing that risk taking that we talked about earlier, and being an engaged part of the mission of the business, which means you have to be attached to the mission. So that's obviously another webinar, but you want to be very clear of that as a culture.
I like how you said, Mike, that if you're doing one of these things, you're probably doing the other. So I think we could assume maybe half of those we surveyed do none. And I can't imagine what that organization might look like when there's no informal sharing, formal sharing, everyone just in their complete silos, their complete boxes, and we're not growing or pushing each other to get better and learn. I can't imagine what that might be like.
Go to the next slide.
And here we asked about the different learning modalities in terms of their organization and how are they sourced. So I know there's a lot, so I'm just going to orient you, and then we'll have Mike provide his commentary here. But we don't do this, is the left-hand side there, and things like apprenticeships, of almost half more than half say they don't do it. And then we looked at, is this designed, prepackaged, or from a third party, or from a university-led program? Thoughts or reactions here, Mike?
Despite the fact on the previous slide, we talked about coaching being impactful and the things that we know about coaching, frame that up against, I don't have enough time. But look at what we're not doing with the one thing that we think really would have an impact, which is between apprenticeships and mentorships and coaching. So what we know, everybody knows the 70-20-10 rule, but literally it's the 70 that has the most impact. I always love to bring up Hermann Ebbinghaus, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. He did that back in the 1800s. And what he measured was his own memory of something. And after a day, something that he learned would drop off if he didn't practice it. So if we look at this and we see that we don't have mentorship programs and we don't have co-ops and apprenticeships, we are seeing some coaching, which is good. And in-house, I actually believe coaching is very good in-house. That's an area to improve. The other thing that didn't come up with this modalities that I think is going to come up in the future, and I'm just throwing it out there, is virtual reality or mixed reality. More and more and more, you're going to see that as a part of this new environment that we operate in. And it's hit mainstream. It's very functional now.
Is that anything akin to simulated environment?
Same
learning?
idea. Absolutely the same idea. And we're seeing it everywhere from, call centers, CSRs working with a frustrated client, to heads up displays for airline mechanics. When they're looking at the engine, they got a heads up display, right? And everything in between. So virtual reality, simulated reality, augmented reality, more and more and more, you're going to see the mechanisms of typing morph more into what we call the invisible interface. It's just there. It's part of what you do.
One final thought on this comment, and you'll see it in the research report, is that high-performing organizations do a blend of these more often. So it's not like they pick one and that's the more successful one. They understand that people like to learn differently. There's different opportunities based on the size of your organization, your budget. So they offer more than one.
And certainly we're going to see differences in that in-person courses or trainings, because while that has been the go-to favorite for a long time, we are in a different reality that just isn't going to permit some of this. So we're going to look for shifts throughout all those modalities over time.
I agree, and I was pleased to see that micro-learnings are being used. If you go back, there's 5 moments of learning need, and micro-learning has a place in the learning need as a reinforcement mechanism. So used in the right way, I think very, very, very useful.
So looking also at the differences between high-performing organizations and the ways they do things differently and how they keep track of all these modalities, the activities, the learners, and the results, we see them, they're more likely to create learning paths for their employees and also track skills inventories and identify adjacent skill sets. So I think in some, they're just more aware of the skills inside the organizations, how these skills move and develop over time. Any thoughts or reactions to what we know about what high-performing organizations do differently with skills tracking?
Well, skills adjacency is something I'd like to call out here. It's a relatively new term, and it's being developed in a useful way a lot by machine learning and so on. But in the past, we had this idea of, if I really had a rare skill that I needed, I was looking for that purple unicorn, that individual that had those unique skills, and I needed to work on it really, really quickly. And the idea of a purple unicorn is it's a mythical creature that doesn't actually exist, right? So rather than pursue this unattainable or just the few, the idea is you take an adjacent skill and see if that might help. And let me give you an example. Natural language processing, which is a machine learning technique. You can maybe look for your next hire from within marketing, because those individuals understand language and the notion behind the language. So instead of just looking in the competitive IT domain, you're also looking in the domain with people who understand language processing, and then maybe that's an adjacent skill to the natural language processing that goes with it. I have a niece who is a journalist and a writer, and she ended up doing exactly that. She wrote the language for a bot, even though she had no IT experience. They went to her and asked her to do that because of her ability to think personality and to do that with language. So the IT environment in the software you're going to see coming out actually exploits this adjacency and looks at skills from one perspective and then looks at how close they are to other skills. And machine learning is doing more and more of that. You're going to see that happen more and more in the next year or two.
And just take us into our last and final poll in the interest of time. This is an agreement question, and we want to know, what level of agreement do you have to this statement? We actively understand our skills inventory and baseline our measures for which we are accountable. So I know that's a triple barrel question.
It is a triple barrel.
We are asking it anyway. And what is your level of agreement to this?
So you understand.
We're asking it anyway because we want to make sure you're doing all three. Mike, you were really clear about that. Like, I think you're about to tell us why. Go ahead.
Well, so it's actually 3 questions. You can understand your skills and have an inventory of them, but you're not baselining your measures. And then remember when we talked about accountability in some previous research. So typically we're violating some of our research approaches here with this question, but we did it on purpose because it is a holistic answer to the question. And once I clarified it, did you notice that the strongly disagree went up? Yeah, see?
Right, that's right. Because, well, it's really difficult. I think
it's hard to do all 3.
Well, it is hard to do all 3, and also it is a timing issue. So because you have to work collaboratively, cross-functionally in order to get information, to build skills inventories, sometimes it's limited in its time depth too. So now it's like, well, we can really only pull off updating skills inventories or learning paths like, maybe every 12 to 18 months or something, but things can change before that. So So sometimes, even if you're making an attempt to do it, it's easy to let time kind of, the slippage gets in the way, right? You lose track of the project. So
good point. Great point.
And about a quarter of them are in the neutral or neither agree, disagree category. So I wonder, maybe it's
yeah,
one.
I feel like I've met these people in the data set. And I don't know, and I kind of want to hear back from listeners too, because I think it is this idea of like, we really try. Like, we know we should, we know we want to, we know we need to track our skills inventories, but it's really, it's really difficult. B, there's time scale involved that slips away. C, there's like, relationships we have to manage across the organization to get that information. And then finally, do you have a tool to be able to track it? It's living in spreadsheets for lots of people. And I know we'll talk about that too. But sometimes those create their own limitations.
I think we're seeing my lack of skills in spelling there in the third option. Awesome. Well, thanks for participating all. Let's go back to the slides, Ben. So I know we were just talking about data-driven approaches and measurement and knowing the baseline of measures, and that's what we asked you in our research. What was the following measured at your organization? Select all that apply. So things from like survey ratings from participants who were part of an L&D program, percentage of learning goals completed, retention. It covers a lot. What do we think here, Mike?
Well, I'm actually encouraged by, there's two kinds of measures: efficiency and effectiveness, and then obviously leading and lagging indicators, leading indicators being predictors. I see some real good measures here in time to productivity and revenue by employee and some of those. So aligning back to the business, that's the good news here. The one thing that I would maybe include here, which accounts for, it's an index, if you will, is this notion of quality of hire. And quality of hire can come as an index of many things, including performance and manager rating and employee satisfaction and so on. So make sure that you always have a mix of efficiency and effectiveness, and make sure that you're aligning to the business as well. Otherwise, we start the self-fulfilling prophecy on how many, how much, how often, and we don't want to do that in isolation. Mm-hmm. Baseline, that's the other thing. Baseline. If you're going to set a measure, make sure you can baseline it so that you can show the change.
Yeah. I also think it's important not just to measure one thing and say you understand all of it. So we know that high-performing organizations, they are more likely to measure a bunch of these things versus just isolate and just look at reactions or turnover. They look at everything. So gathering data, collecting data on humans, as we all know, is super challenging. We also looked at the technology used and that might store or track or monitor these types of data. And the same type of format here in this question, we asked what tools are used within the organization to create learning paths and identify adjacent skill sets. So ordered from we don't do this to we do it. And then what do they use it for? So for tracking skills, identifying adjacent skill sets, creating learning paths, and also monitoring and tracking learning activities.
We're seeing some real movement in technology. Cornerstone made a significant investment in a skills oncology engine, and you're seeing others as well. But when it comes particularly to the adjacent skill sets and being able to align those to tags for a learning path, if you will, to get to that adjacent skill set, the machine learning that you're going to see come out in these areas in the next 2 years is staggering. And I've been around a long time. I don't usually use technology terms in that regard, but it is game changing. So I think that if you're thinking about this, if you're looking for this, start to pay attention to the industry and what the industry is doing to attack this, because it's a known entity, and there are some significant technologies that are being developed for this.
Yeah. I mean, more to your point, Mike, earlier about the intelligence of things, right? We need, with the pace of change and with the scale at which we need to address the change, we are going to need help to recognize what we need to do next. So, I mean, a lot of us have access to learning management software and systems. Some of those are going to start building in new kinds of functionality, but we need to do more. I mean, those will help us track who's participated in what training, whether or not they passed the course, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how it's integrating with performance. So looking for
the behavior change.
Right, and it's looking
Yeah.
for those tools that will give us insight into connecting our outcome, our desired outcome, with what our activity was.
Agreed.
And also sometimes that missing, the front part of that is missing, like thinking about what the business need is and what outcomes do we need to affect. You can't just put a technology in there and think it's going to solve your business challenges. You need to understand what those are first as an L&D professional.
That's strategies and measure. Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and Jenna's used to hearing me say, computers are still computers and they can do a lot of things, but if it's garbage in, it's garbage out. So you still, at the end of the day, need to be able to invest in your own savvy to understand what's meaningful, how to upskill the equipment before you can upskill others, before you can new skill others.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm going to take us to some new skilling action items, and we go in a lot more detail in the research report that we'll release next week, but we want to share just some of the summaries that we've talked about today about how to uncover skills needs, including using feedback and assessments and performance metrics, the importance of inventory, the skills and abilities of your current workforce, and compare those to the needs you have now and the needs you might need in the future. And looking at the balance of technical and professional skills for roles at your organization. We talked about inviting contributions for learning content for peer-to-peer employee-led learning as part of your learning plan, and looking at different modalities as part of that too. And also using technology to uncover needs, to monitor process, and to modify learning. Like, I'm assuming you agree with all these because you were part of the research, but anything that we're not thinking here or we should think about when we talk about action items for new skilling?
No, just a humorous point. Set the goals for what it is you want to do with new skilling and then baseline it. Did I mention? Baseline it. So I think as you set these goals for that behavior change, you're looking for impact to the business. Make sure you're aligned with the goals, with the business as you start to go after this. But no, I agree with all 6 of these wholeheartedly.
Yeah, I think what's great about these 6 too, and this, I mean, these all came from the research. These are things that some organizations are doing. So it's not like we just extrapolated these based on some ideal future set of conditions. These are things that organizations are doing that contribute to the eventual process of new skilling. So these are things that you can do, right, in your own organization. And it's just ticking through the action items and starting to build in that direction.
Absolutely. I think we're time for any questions coming in from the audience, Mary Fran. We would love.
Well, I'm taking a look around. This is a time to give us some questions. We do have a few minutes to ask some things. We do have some people who have already kind of weighed in with just some clarification points. They do want to know what domain expertise means when we mentioned it in that graph. And I think that is an important thing to spell out. I know that when I was coding those, there was a call for domain expertise in the sense of like highly professional fields. Like we need somebody who is a geologist. So they have to come with a geology degree. Or even like we need a CNC operator, somebody who's used this machine. So some of that comes under HR.
I need HR expertise. That's a skill domain.
Exactly. So just to clarify for the audience, that's what we're talking about. Is people are saying like, we're going to kick you out of our ATS system if we don't see that you have 5 years of experience in this specific field. So that's what we mean there. But
whether or not the product only has been out for 3 years. Such a great story.
I really love that too. Let's see. This listener didn't give me their name, but they're trying to figure out whether or not they've encountered some of these situations. They don't know if they're naturally good at dealing with it or not. Like change hasn't necessarily hit their organization yet. So maybe you can sort of see a situation, Mike, can't you, in which there are organizations in which maybe haven't been radically upended or affected in the same way that they maybe were during the Great Recession previously. I'm thinking about home building right now. Home building, for whatever reason, continues. and not a lot has changed. Pricing strategies, supply chains have changed a little bit, but they haven't had to change their practices radically in the way that maybe they did. So they don't really see or feel a change on the horizon. But what would you tell them? Because I know the research is kind of telling us that that doesn't necessarily mean you're safe.
Well, let me take it, and the construction industry in particular is a good example, but let me take a little bit of a different tack, and I'm going to go back to tech, so please apologize. But Boeing found out that it was competing with Google for talent, right? You wouldn't think that. So as you find yourself in this era of skills scarcity, not necessarily people scarcity, but skills scarcity, pay attention to the involuntary churns, because the labor statistics show us that they taper off during the initial impact like we see now. But as those voluntary churns start to come back up again, pay attention to that. Pay attention to where they're going. Have stay interviews. Make that investment. Change is not just about a one-time event. It's a process. And you want to make sure that once people get past stage one, which is literally grieving, things aren't the way that they used to be, then you want to make sure that people are adapting and adjusting, and for no other reason to keep them around and to help the organization, but also from a productivity perspective and from a human perspective. Back to your point about heart.
Yeah. No, that's one of my favorite things to say about this whole thing, is it is about heart. Sandra has something really interesting, which I don't think we've hit on in any detail. She asks us, has there been any research on the concept of new skilling in the context of an aging workforce?
Well, I can count myself in that cohort. No, there has not been any meaningful research yet in that particular area. But what I will tell you is what I always tell people, which is, we used to have this, okay, all the things that Gen Y is changing the workplace in and the consumer environment associated with that. Candidly, I am here to tell you that we're all feeling that. It's not just Gen Y. We all have those expectations, those consumer expectations. There was some research done by, I think, the Neuroscience Institute that said as we get older as employees, our pattern matching abilities go up, even though necessarily the new skilling isn't necessarily at the forefront. Candidly, if we're good at pattern matching as we go along, leverage that. That's an adjacent skill for a variety of things. So brain-based learning tells us that about that workforce.
Mike, I love that, because I like to say I'm getting better at seeing the forest for the tree.
Mm-hmm.
One last one before we leave. Well, actually, I'm going to put two of them together. Marie wants to know, do we need to tie our skill inventories to competencies? And then Evelyn just wants one more word about the cornerstone instrument that you mentioned earlier about the skills ontology. So if you would, Mike.
Evelyn, and Jen, I'll let you answer the first part of the question if you'd like. Evelyn, look up Clustree, Clustree. That will help take you where you need to go.
Yeah. So then, Marie, skill inventories tied to competencies.
I think what's happening is we need to think of competencies and skills and so on. You're seeing a movement toward capabilities. All right, what are my capabilities? And you're going to see this more and more with the notion of a blockchain briefcase. I'm bringing my own mechanisms together. So it's the composition of what I can do, how I can do it, and what I've done, and the mindset that I bring that you're going to see start coming together. So they're not mutually exclusive in any way, shape, or form. Start thinking about capabilities rather than competencies or skills.
Oh, we do. We have a capability framework that we talk about all the time for HR. So yeah, we're there.
Mike, that is a great way actually for us to end. We are at the end of our time. I think this has been a very engaging hour. I was taking my own notes as I'm listening to you today, Mike. So, and I just shout out to our audience. Thank you for your questions. If you have any other questions that you would like to forward to Mike or Jenna, we can be sure you get those after today's webcast. As we go out today, I just want to remind everyone to check for credits for today's webcast. We have these approved through HRCI and SHRM. The credits for attending this webcast will show up in your My HCI profile under the transcript tab. I just want to thank our cornerstone sponsors this week, making this webcast possible, this entire project. We love working with Cornerstone. big brains over there, and we just love the conversations we have. Our new research will be available in coming weeks. So thank you to Mike and Jenna for talking about that research and sharing it with us today. I just want to thank you all again for joining us and listening to us. Again, pass on your questions for Mike and Jenna. I'll be sure to get those. And from all of us here at HCI, thanks again for joining. Have a great week.